Hello, and welcome to Ask the History Buff, the podcast that informs and educates about Canada's Christian history. Hopefully, you will be inspired to research various aspects of Canadian history because you heard it on Ask the History Buff. Each week, we will explore the lives of influencers, events which they influenced, and the legacy which we as Canadians have inherited because of the influencer or the events. I am Lynette, your curious Canadian history buff. I'm not a degreed historian with letters behind my name, but I have researched more Canadian history than most people. I am always discovering new and interesting information about Canadian history, which excites me. And that's why I call myself the Curious Canadian History Buff. I hope you will be encouraged to Google people's names and events surrounding them like I do to understand their impact on our society. If and when you Google something you heard on Ask the History Buff, don't forget to follow the rabbit trails. I challenge you to click on every link and Google every person named in any article that you Google. And for Canadian Christian listeners, I encourage you to live like a Berean by searching out everything you hear. And that principle comes from Acts chapter 10, verse 17. And if you are just too busy to search for any information, then ask the history buff. Chances are I may have the answers. And if I don't, I will look for the answers and get back to you. So feel free to challenge my information anytime by sending your questions and concerns to info@christianrootscanada.org. You may teach me something. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and to like and share this podcast at christianrootscanada.podbean.com. For the month of August, we will be looking at some of the Christian personalities celebrated in various cities on the first Monday of August every year. Today, we will tell you about the person whom Ottawa celebrates, the indefatigable engineer par excellence by the name of John By. So, who was Colonel John By? John By was an Anglican who was trained at the Royal Military Academy in London. He had risen to the rank of colonel and an engineer par excellence in the Royal Military. He was an innovator with an eye for detail and design. He was an original thinker and a problem solver, and he worked many contingencies into building the Rideau Canal system. These contingencies included his extensive use of dams to flood major rapids, creation of lakes of navigable depth, and controlling the spring runoff along the Rideau Canal. He was a leader, and he led by example. He was a teacher and a people person. Instead of living at the military base in Kingston, removed from his workers, he chose to establish his headquarters among his workers. He had developed a camp at the confluence of the Rideau and Ottawa rivers And that action initiated the beginning of a little town called Bytown, which grew so rapidly that by 1855 it was renamed Ottawa. Because of his example and leadership, several of his assistants became generals who served with distinction in high office throughout British colonies the world over. So when you visit the Byward Market, please think fondly of John By. So we will start our information about John By with wars and rumors of wars. Between 1800 and 1801, the Executive Council of Upper Canada had learned of a plot by the Americans to overthrow British rule, and John By was dispatched to the Canadas in 1802 with responsibilities for shoring up the defenses of Quebec and to construct a new canal at the Cascades near Ile de Cascade. With the help of Jean-Baptiste Duberger in 1804, a scale model of Quebec with its defense works was built and sent to England. At that time, Quebec City was the most important military base of Britain in North America. In 1826, the Inspector General of Fortifications at the Board of Ordnance. The Board of Ordnance is responsible for building and maintaining infrastructure to support military campaigns. So the Inspector General of Fortifications at the Board of Ordnance chose Colonel John By to superintend a canal to be built to link Ottawa at the head of the Ottawa River to Kingston, to the fort at Kingston, Fort Henry, on Lake Ontario, via the Rideau and Cataraqui rivers. Colonel By arrived in Quebec in 1826, and by late 1832, he was back in England with the project completed and operational. 5 years. This project was undertaken because of a perceived threat of invasion from the United States. Now remember that relationships were not always amicable, amiable, or peaceful with the United States and Canada when it was a British colony. Even though that seems like a ludicrous idea in 2024, a threat of invasion seems like a ludicrous idea in 2024, the relationship between the US and Canada was not always peaceful, nor amiable, nor amicable. For example, in 1794, Simcoe. Remember Simcoe? We just studied Simcoe. I just told you about Simcoe. Simcoe prepared for an American invasion instead of focusing on road building. Then, between 1800 and 1801, the Upper Canada Executive Council learned of a plot by the Americans to overthrow British rule in the colonies to the north. It did not happen. And that was the cause of John By's first visit to the Canadas. In 1812, we know what happened. There was that war of 1812 by that name. In 1837, 1838, there was the Upper Canada and Lower Canada rebellions, which were fomented by US operatives. The Canadian ringleaders, both in Quebec and Ontario, who were promoting republicanism, fled to the US. Among them was Laurier. Among them was Laurier. He became premier afterwards. Anyways, I digress. In 1869 and 1870, there were the Red River rebellions, and though that rebellion was stoked by US senators in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and North Dakota, they had hoped that Louis Riel would secede to the US and so change the map of Canada. So the fact is, before and after 1812, the only way for Canada to defend itself against an invasion was along the St. Lawrence River. The fort in Kingston was at a disadvantage. That war of 1812 exposed Canada's vulnerability in terms of military supply lines to the St. Lawrence from Montreal to Kingston. There was agreement that an alternative route was necessary. So soon after that, there were recommendations with no actions. You know what that's like. After the War of 1812, recommendations were made to the British Parliament about the necessity of building a canal. In 1815, a study of the canal route was ordered. In 1816, a survey of the Rideau Canal route was done. In 1818, the Duke of Richmond was sent to Quebec to report on the kind of defenses existing in the colonies. His review included a description of what needed to be done to build the canal system, the Rideau Canal system. On his own authority, he attempted to build the canal with 2 companies of the Royal Staff Corps, but he died in the process of inspecting the canal route. It was not until 1825 before another team, this time a group of engineer officers, was sent to report on the defenses of the Canadas, Upper and Lower Canada. They again recommended that the canal system should be built. The Duke of Wellington, in charge of the ordnance, remember the ordnance takes care of military supplies, he gave full support to start the project in 1826. An uninterrupted route for the transportation of troops and artillery was commissioned by Queen Victoria to take troops from Ottawa to Kingston. John By's ingenuity, with the help of famed stonemasons Thomas Mackay and Peter Redpath, overcame the challenges of rock blasting and malarial decimation of his crew, who worked in the swamps to create the Rideau Canal, an engineering marvel which still functions almost 200 years later. So here are some of the rigorous and stringent evaluations that were done. John By had specific instructions to follow with respect to the dimensions of the locks. He was told to build locks that were 100 feet long and 22 feet wide. But he figured that those dimensions were inadequate for accommodating small naval vessels and their spars of white pine as per Royal Navy requirements. He proposed instead locks that were 150 feet long and 50 feet wide. He provided 2 sets of estimates to the Colonial Office, the one they asked for and the one he was proposing. Governor Dalhousie advised him to make a strong case to his superiors for permission to enlarge the locks. His superiors were so astonished by his appeal for larger locks. They viewed the request as radical, which would result naturally in higher costs. They therefore consulted with senior engineer officers who commended Bai's work and agreed with the need for larger locks. Still not satisfied, they consulted with Nova Scotia's Lieutenant Governor, Sir James Kemp, asking him to actually visit the site so he could advise them on the work already done and the size of the locks. On traveling the length of the locks in 1827, so this work started already in 1826. Remember that we didn't have airplanes as yet, and things took a long while to get across the ocean by ocean liners and the mail and that kind of stuff. So it took a while. So the building of the locks started in 1826, but this is 1827 when Kemp is coming to do a site analysis. So on traveling the length of the locks in 1827, Kemp agreed with John Bai's recommendations and even endorsed them. However, he recommended locks that were 134 feet instead of 150 long and 33 wide instead of 50 feet wide. John Bai's senior officers in London and the Ordnance approved the recommendations, and John Bai proceeded to build the locks to the new dimensions. Here's an account of the impressive structures and manpower that he employed in building the locks from Ottawa to Kingston. At completion, the Rideau Canal system included 42 masonry locks, 52 dams, most of which were masonry also, and an arched structure at Jones Falls over 60 feet tall. That made it the highest canal structure in North America at that time. To compensate for the 80-foot drop from the Rideau River to the Ottawa River, 8 locks had to be built at the mouth of the Rideau, which are the 8 locks you see in Ottawa by the Chateau Laurier. John Bai's instructions for building the canal involved using civilian contractors for everything. This amazing work was laid out and supervised by Colonel Bai and his subordinates at the Royal Engineers. It was all undertaken with simple methods of construction, and these included drilling rocks manually, lifting heavy timbers for lock gates, and lifting blocks of finished masonry for lock walls, all done by physical manpower or the use of hand-operated winches and derricks. Excavations by hand, even though many contractors were inexperienced, causing much grief and legal hassles when they were let go. John Bai harnessed quite the army of laborers. Peak employment included 2,000 men plus his 2 companies of army laborers. Two companies of the Royal Sappers and Miners, that's what they were called. He cleared forests along the way, setting up rough camps for them to live in, and he lived with them. All supplies were brought to them by canoes and small boats. The greatest and most serious difficulty was outbreaks of malaria because of the mosquitoes in the swamps. The worst year was 1828 at the Cataraqui River, where by lost hundreds of workers to the disease. Even John By came down with severe malaria and almost died. But he recovered and resumed the work. So here's some interesting information about the stonemasons of the canal. In the fall of 1826, John By arrived at the mouth of the Rideau River to begin making preparations for building the canal. By the spring of 1827, he made a canoe trip to scope out the potential work sites. He had a party of men with him who had vested interest in the project, and they traveled 123 miles. The route was 123 miles long. The genius of John By allocated 5 construction sites to 5 expert stonemasons, and the work was to be done over 5 summers. So 5 years, 5 construction sites, 5 specialized stonemasons, the best of the best. 4 of the expert stonemasons, Thomas Mackay, John Redpath, I think Alan White, I think is the name, and the guy by Phillips, had formed a partnership. So 4 of the 5 stonemasons formed a partnership just to build the canal system. Okay? 4 of them formed a partnership. And that partnership, they dissolved when the project was finished. The 5th person was a guy called Drummondville. Now, they were all put in charge of different sections. That way, John By could focus on one section a year for 5 years. Thomas Mackay was responsible for the first 8 locks, each 10 feet tall. John Redpath and Thomas Mackay were responsible for building the locks at Jones Falls, the highest locks on the canal. It was described as one of the most extensive engineering projects at any single location on the Rideau Canal. Andrew White and Thomas Phillips constructed the locks at Long Island and Black Rapids, respectively. Robert Drummond was responsible for the locks at Kingston Mills, Davis Mills, and Brewers Mills. This was purported to be the 3rd most extensive work of the canal. So look at this. The most extensive one was the Jones Fall, one of the most extensive engineering projects. So it was that one. The 8 locks, 10 feet tall, that was the other one. And the next one was the one that Drummondville, next work site was the one that Drummondville worked on at the Cataraqui River. And he built the Kingston Mills, Brewers Mills, and Davis Mills. So this was the 3rd most extensive work of the canal project. John By was so pleased with the work of these expert stonemasons that he presented them each with a silver cup in recognition of their work. When the canal was finished, he traveled the length of the canal with his family and friends in May of 1832. That same year, he was dealt an evil blow from his superiors in Britain, being dragged through the mud. When John By returned to England, he was blissfully unaware that his integrity was on the line by his superiors until 1833. After the War of 1812, Britain seemed concerned about the lack of proper defenses for the colonies. So I want to recap what was happening before and how John By was commissioned to take care of building defenses to defend Upper and Lower Canada. So after the War of 1812, Britain seemed concerned about the lack of proper defenses for the colonies of Canada. Studies on building the Rideau Canal were undertaken in 1815 and 1816. Building the canal was actually begun in 1818 by the Duke of Richmond, who died in the process. Another study on building the canal was done again in 1825 with the decision to complete the canal. The Duke of Wellington, who was above, he was in charge of the ordnance, military supplies, and he gave John By the okay to go ahead. The Duke of Wellington, in charge of the ordnance, gave full support to the start of the project in 1826. John By had reported that he had been given specific instructions by Wellington not to wait for parliamentary grants, but to proceed with all dispatch consistent with economy. So he urged him to start in 1826. In 1826, authorization for work to begin on the canal was given with only preliminary estimates of £169,000. It was not until late in 1827 that John By could give a more accurate estimate of £474,000. Now remember, in 1827, that's when they sent the lieutenant governor from Nova Scotia to come and do a site inspection after the work had begun. So Wellington said, hurry up, start it, it's important. Go ahead, I endorse you, don't wait for parliamentary money, parliamentary approval. And then the colonial office in Britain sent Kemp to say, because they're trying to save costs, they didn't believe John By knew what he was talking about. They had engineers come, they consulted with them, the engineer said, John By is correct. What you were proposing would not work. So they weren't satisfied, they sent Kemp. So they kept delaying the proper estimates for the work. Delays in the vetting process about the dimensions of the locks were caused by those superior officers in Britain. First, they consulted with senior engineers who approved John By's estimates of the larger locks to be built. The expert opinions of the engineers were not enough for them. They caused further delays by sending Lieutenant Governor Kemp of Nova Scotia to do an on-site evaluation, further delaying final estimates even though work had already begun. Kemp agreed on the building of larger locks that were proposed by John By and affirmed by the Royal Engineers, but he reduced the size somewhat, thus affecting the estimates one more time. The estimates rose to £800,000. And that figure included some defense works which were not specifically approved by the Ordnance Department or the Treasury. In 1832, when the Ordnance Department received John By's last estimate, they did not follow the usual protocol. It is reported that they took the unusual step of submitting it directly to the Treasury. 4 days later, the Treasury issued a memo to John By, which was severe in its criticism of his overspending. They demanded that he return to answer the accusation about his accounting, not knowing that he was already on the way home. That criticism cut to the bone, and there is no record that he was ever given the opportunity to defend himself before any committee. He would have been happy to submit the financial records for their inspection. He was meticulous at record keeping, and that extended not just to his individual work, but to the work on the canal also. Well, senior officers plus Lieutenant Governor Kemp supported him privately, but no one came to his defense publicly, even though he, his wife, and senior army friends pleaded with them to go to show public support. It is a shame that he died without his name being cleared, in spite of the fact that there was a lot of evidence in his favor. In the end, John By fell victim to bureaucratic and political games between government departments, the Treasury versus the Ordnance, accusing them of insufficient control over expenditure. He just happened to be the useful scapegoat to prove the Treasury's point that the Ordnance did not exercise enough control over their expenditures. John By ended his days in disgrace and disappointment because he was unfairly accused of financial mismanagement. The British government, not understanding the insurmountable difficulties he overcame to construct the canal, which they knew since after 1812, they knew that it was important. They did not understand the difficulties that he overcame to construct the canal, and they convened a court of inquiry which robbed him of the honor he so deserved. So, what were his commendations? He received very little commendations. He received a few words of commendation from the king, but that was just a few words. But Canada thanked John By. John By went back to England to criticism and condemnation. But in Canada, the accolades poured out. His achievements garnered loud praises from the citizens of Montreal and Brockville and Kingston. It is said that the Montreal Committee of Trade concluded an address to him with these words: "An undertaking of great magnitude and importance, the successful accomplishment of which, in so comparatively short a period, notwithstanding the unheard of inestimable difficulties and impediments which had to be encountered and surmounted in an almost unexplored and uninhabited wilderness, evinced on your part a moral courage and an undaunted spirit and combination of science and management equally exciting our admiration and deserving our praise. Today, John By's statue overlooks the locks in Ottawa. There is a park named for him, Major's Hill Park, because he was a major at first, I guess. But Major's Hill Park is where John By's statue, looks down at the locks. You can see his half of his statue when you look up from down at the locks. So next time you visit the Bytown Museum and in Ottawa and the Rideau Canal Museum in Smiths Falls, just stand in awe and remember the sacrifice of Colonel John By. Today, that canal, Rideau Canal, services about 80 vessels, 80 crafts a day going through during the summer. For the 3 months of the summer, 80 crafts a day going through. They process 80 crafts a day going along the canal for leisure. The war never came. It was never used as a military route, but today many boaters enjoy the fact that they can go along the canal. I hope people would share this information with boaters. And that when you two areas, the Bytown, remember, became Ottawa, and when you go to the Bytown Museum, remember John By. So, could you spot the influencers in this episode? What were the major events which John By influenced, which still we benefit from today? How has his legacy reached down the ages to 2024? So I'll encourage you again, be a Berean and go ahead and fact check me. So watch for our next episode when we will examine the political and legislative legacy left by Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie of Sarnia, because on the first Monday of August, Sarnia celebrates Alexander Mackenzie Day. And if you want to learn more about Canada's Christian roots, check out our website at www.christianrootscanada.org. And if you watch the video recording of this episode and other episodes, you can watch them at christianrootscanada.org/articles. Or you can find Christian Roots Canada on YouTube and Rumble. Please like and share our videos and audios, not to influence the algorithms. I do not care about the algorithms, but to influence, to have a greater reach to other Christians with the truth of our Christian heritage. You can listen to our podcasts at christianrootscanada.podbean.com. So see you in the next episode. Bye for now. Have you ever wondered why Quebec is so different from the rest of Canada? Why is there a French presence in Canada? And where did they come from? If you have not delved into our history from France, I almost guarantee you that you didn't know that Canada was first colonized by persecuted Huguenots, the French Protestants. At first, a small group of them were given fur trading monopolies by King Henry IV. Then, others came after Henry IV died. They fled from Cardinal Richelieu and his brutal French Catholic regime. And why did that happen? Let me introduce you to the French Connection. The French Connection is a story-based video history course linking our history to the marble frieze mounted over the left doorway of the House of Commons. It shows Francis I on the left and Louis XIV on the right. These kings also bookend stories of the persecution of the Huguenots, which started under Francis I and continued until Louis XIV, except for under Henry IV. The course covers 200 years of history, uncovering the stories of the Huguenots who established the first colonies in the Atlantic provinces, Quebec, and Ontario. This program is the first of its kind. It's chronological, explicitly biblical, with video based stories for all of the family. It traces God's providence in bringing different people together to write His story. In September 2024, we will be introducing our new additions to the course, the new student workbook and the new answer key. The workbook contains questions, quizzes, projects, essays, extra readings, supplemental videos, a final test, and so much more. You will also get 6 modules, which breaks down into 26 video stories and lesson outlines, as well as an audio version and an ebook. There are also maps and charts and timelines and photos and other extra student only resources. So here's the steal of the deal. Compared to other Canadian history courses, you get 26 video lessons, the audio version, so you can re listen to the content anywhere, anytime, an ebook, the new student workbook, the new answer sheet, and for homeschooled high schoolers, the equivalence of 1 Canadian history credit. Here's an extra bonus. You don't have to purchase annual licenses for each student in the same household. It's a one-time purchase deal. You have permanent access for use by all students in the same household. And here's a great deal for you. Until September 6th, all listeners get a 10% off coupon because you listen to Ask the History Buff. Just use the code HistoryBuff at checkout to get the entire course for only $270. I call that a steal of a deal.